In this video, I would like to summarize some of the key points and takeaways I demonstrated to you in the previous class when I introduced you to how to do digital rendering in Blender. Before we do this, let's go to Safari or Chrome on the browser of your choice. Let's type in Studio Photography and let's look at the photos. One of the main problems is when you're new to digital rendering, no software has a make awesome rendering button. We still have to design our scene, place lights, work with the camera, make materials, etc. And that can be a daunting task. If we now take a look at all these images, there are certain elements that actually stand out and can be used for our own virtual digital photography. So for example, number one that really is noticeable is that most of the time there's always some sort of a backdrop or clean environment. So for example here, the stool stands on a white backdrop that's rolled down, and because this is a bendable material, we have a nice arced background, or we don't really have a sharp edge, which in the photo later will look much softer and nicer. For example, like in this case here, you see everything is nice and soft. But the backdrop can also be part of the room. You see, for example, here, the back corner, they worked in a little bit. When we continue talking about the backdrop, it can also be white, it can be black, it can basically be whatever color or texture you want. It can also be matte, but it can also, for example, be glossy. So here it's a little bit reflective and slightly blurry, so there's a little bit of reflection you see. And here the surface is very polished, so the reflection is nice and clean, so you pay more attention to the reflection, which can be good. Can also be negative because you might actually get distracted by it. Backdrops and also our complete object will be inside an environment. Now either we can build an environment, or for something like this we can also use then an HDRI background image. And the main reason for that is you see the backgrounds can be white and black. That's the basic colors, and maybe the backdrop or the black is the ceiling. It can also be a wall. For example, here you see the sides are all blackened. So in this case it would be the sides. And the main reason for that is, let's say we take a photo of a metallic object which has nice reflective surfaces. You don't want something distracting show up inside the reflection, which is why your studio environment should be suitable for how you will also design what will show up in reflections on your objects. For example, when we work with cars, that's very useful. Here in this case, you also see they have some cloth hanging down. Now those can be used for creating reflections, or they can also be used as light diffusers. But for example, here with a car, you see the car is in a big environment, so it's including it. And we see a lot of reflections actually on the car, but because everything is nice and white, the reflections first don't stand out very much and are also nice and uniform. So let's talk about lights, for example. One of the key elements is we work with a direct light and we work with indirect lighting. Or for example, we work with key lights and fill lights. And the amount of lights most times you need are maybe 2 to 3. That's kind of like all you need. So for example, the position of the lights is important. A key light is very strong, that illuminates you see the most. And then we have a fill light. The fill light basically brightens up darker areas and shadows we don't want to see. And the size of the light is also important. So you see here left and right, and on top is some sort of an illuminating surface. If we take a look at here, you see the light is huge, really nice and big. And this light placed actually on top of the car, it not only illuminates it, but also creates then those nice light reflections. If we go back to here, there we see the same 1, 2, and 3. So the left light illuminates the face, the right light illuminates maybe the rest a little bit, and then we have a big light also coming from the top, illuminating the whole scene a little bit. Now these are light boxes. They have a fabric in front of the light, so the main light is basically not very sharp or harsh, but the light that comes out is nicely diffused, creating soft shadows. And in digital rendering, we will use an area light, and the bigger the light, the softer the shadow, the smaller the light, the sharper the shadow. But we can also work, for example, with a spotlight. If we put this on an object, it will be kind of like a direct lighting and very harsh. So you see here with the direct lighting and the light source not having some sort of a diffuser, it creates a kind of harsh lighting environment, and we get very nice and crisp shadows. But the question is, do you always want to have sharp shadows? Because sometimes they can also be very distracting. And also the illumination is very sharp, because we can also create shadows directly on the object, not necessarily off the object onto the backdrop, which is why area lights are most times what we will use. But spotlights can also be very useful for, in this case, to cast a light pattern actually onto the backdrop. And you see that even here there is a huge spotlight again that shines onto the area behind the kids. So when we take a photo, or let's say we make a rendering with an object, then there's some sort of a halo behind the object. Now we can do all this stuff in Photoshop, but well, when we're inside a digital rendering, why don't we just do everything exactly the same way or the way we want, so we can render it out and don't later have to do post work in a secondary application. Okay, so let's go to Blender and let's get started. We will create a backdrop first. So for example, there are multiple ways how we can create a backdrop. So I just created a plane, and then in edit mode I can select this one edge, then press E and then Z. So for example, I move it up, and then I can move it slightly back. Perfect. Okay. I'm also currently set to meters, so this is 2 meters left and right. Let's say I would like this to be 4 meters. I can switch to grid snap and then select those edges, move them, and while holding Control, snap to the grid. Perfect. And maybe this step forward, and maybe here a little bit back. Okay, now here we have the sharp edge, and in edit mode, Control B, I could, if I want, actually adjust this one. But then I hard modeled or direct modeled this in, which is not really what I want. So I don't do it to the backdrop. In object mode, then I will go to modifiers and add a bevel modifier. You see this is currently the only sharp edge, so we can set this to an angle, let's say over a distance of maybe a meter or 80 centimeters. With a segment of 10, please round this, and then there you can see how this nicely rounds. And everybody who knows G1 or G2, there's for example a profile, and you see currently with this setting this looks like G1 tangent. That's exactly how this works. And if we make this a tick smaller, you see we flatten this. But what I want is maybe to go to something like 6 or 0.7. You see this is a nicer transition. With 0.5, you really see the line, and then the arc starts. And with 0.7, we have the line, and then the arc continues the direction of the line a little bit, and then softer blends. In object mode, we can go to tools, and then we can go to shading and shade smooth, so it's nice and soft. Perfect. Now that's our backdrop. Okay, good. Let's add an object. Maybe I will create a small pedestal. In edit mode, we can quickly press S to scale this one down, S and Z to scale along the Z axis, and for example a little bit more, and then G and Z, and I will put this very close to the ground. Now, why don't I put it perfectly on the ground? Well, the thing is, in real life, we don't really have everything perfectly lined up when we put it on the ground. So there can be small gaps. So that's fine. And for example, we can shade this one smooth. And then we get this crazy artifact. That's fine. We can simply go to the object data panel and then turn auto smooth on. What auto smooth basically does is where you have different faces at angles. For example, on the top face, you see here there are all these different lines, and the angle between them is very small. So the software can kind of like interpolate and understand this should be shaded nice and soft, while actually this angle and this angle, well, it's a 90-degree. This can't be shaded round. So the auto smooth basically breaks edges for you. And then with the angle, we can define what we want. So 120 obviously is not really functional. 30 we can use. Okay, good. Then let's add our object to illuminate. Maybe we can work with Suzanne. We can scale her down a little bit and put her on the pedestal. There. And maybe move everything a little bit away from the backdrop. Okay, good. So now we have kind of like our backdrop and the object. So you see like the backdrop should be nice and big enough of our, so it covers actually our subject matter. Now it's time to place actually a camera and then lights. Let's start with the camera. It doesn't matter what view you work in. So Shift A, and then let's create an axis. And this axis, for example, I will call camera target. And maybe we can keep it the size, or we can scale it. Don't get into the habit to scale empties with S. We can do it, but most times beginners, you can do it for camera tracking, but you know, with an array, scaling an object or scaling the empty will influence the array. So in general, it's good practice, I think, to just adjust the size via the empty property. Then Shift A, let's add a camera. So the camera we can move, for example, to at the moment to somewhere else, and the camera looks to the direction you looked into the scene when you create another camera. You see it rotates that way. Let's delete this one first. Let's select the empty. We move the empty away. Okay, so what's the whole deal with empty and camera? Well, in a studio environment, we have a tripod or a fixture we can put the camera onto. And then we can adjust the position, the height, and the rotation. And to position the camera correctly, we always have to look through the camera. Well, we can actually, in digital rendering, tell a camera to always look at a certain reference object, for example, the empty. And then when we put the empty onto a particular part, an area of interest on an object, then this way we know actually the camera looks right at that particular part. Okay, so camera, and then Shift select the empty, and then we can press Ctrl T to make a track, and we select track to constraint. And you see when we select the camera now and we go to constraint, there auto track and camera track target. The camera we can scale a little bit, or we can do the size here, there. Okay, so we can move this around. You see the camera always looks at the empty, and when I move the empty, the camera follows it. Perfect. Okay. So we can, for example, put this one to there, put this one to there. I would like to make sure that the camera is maybe directly in front of Suzanne. So along the x-axis, I have to set this to 0. Perfect. Okay, press 0 on your keypad, then we can zoom in a little bit. Now, you will see it's difficult to adjust the camera, and then we can go to there and press 0, which is kind of silly to do, which is why at this point it really makes sense to slice your environment, sorry, not your environment, your interface into multiple segments. So now, for example, here I can easily work in 3D mode, and then on top I can see where my camera is, and then this way nicely can position and design my shot. Okay, good. While we work with the camera, a few elements to cover. We have something called focal length. If I get the camera very close, and let's say we set this to 5. Now let's get her closer, and you see the perspective distortion. So that's basically what happens when we have a very low value for the focal length. Think about it as a fisheye lens. Now if we set this to 120, you see this works kind of like a tele zoom. We can get very close, but we don't get the same perspective for shortening or distortion. So essentially with a really high lens value, as you see even here in the scene, we actually step away and then we zoom in. With a very low focal length, basically we get very close. The 35 is kind of like a good number if you want to have a nice dramatic perspective for shortening, and something like 55 or 75 I use a lot when I have to make renderings where I need to have perspective for shortening, but I want to limit its effect. Okay. There are also compositional guides, for example. We can turn on thirds or golden, etc., based on what you want to work with. There's also a pass per tube, so we can clip out the environment, so we only see, it's kind of like the viewfinder, what later will show up in the rendering. And then there's depth of field and some other stuff, which we will cover at a later point. And here are 2 buttons, perspective and orthographic. The nice thing about doing digital rendering is, well, if you make a product, we can later position our camera at the same level and then make orthographic renderings, for example, for technical illustration or dimensioning. And we simply switch between the lens type. Okay. Now we have a backdrop, we have our subject, we need lights. So let's put the 3D cursor somewhere else. Shift A, for example, an area light, and Shift A, another empty. Also here the empty, let's make this one nice and small so it's not too big. Let's move this away. Select the area light. And let's take a look at the light properties. So currently the light is 10 centimeters. Let's make this maybe 2 meters. So a nice big light box. Under square, there's also a rectangle, for example, and then this way we can actually decide the size of the area light as well. Now again, to make a track, select the object, and then shift select the empty. But before we do this, let's give this actually area left, maybe target, and then the area light, shift left mouse button, select the empty, Control T, and then track it. Or we can select the area light, go to constraints, go to add constraints, under tracking say track 2, and then select the area, the empty. But now it doesn't look at it, and that's okay. Well, first look 2, we have to set this to -z, and then up is y, and there it is. Let's switch actually to local. So you see actually the -z, that's actually where the area light has this dotted line, and that is actually the direction it emits light. So in every render software where you work with lights, you will see the direction the light shines to. Most times that's a cone for spotlight or a line for an area light or sun. And basically with this, we tell the software, well, which direction do I want my area light to look at the empty? So currently it looks always away from the empty. So Z, -Z, now it will look at the empty. And then we also have to adjust what is actually the up vector, Z or Y. Okay, perfect. Now in my case, I will switch this to X, so I have the shorter part on the ground. Now I can move this one to there, and maybe this one closer, go to side view. Let's move them all down, and there. Okay, good. We can select the empty and the light, and then Shift D, make a copy, and maybe this empty we move to there. And for example, this now I call, maybe this is actually right, and this is maybe left, and again give good names, so later when you have to create relationships, it's easy to find all your different area lights and objects. And I will make one more area light there, and for example this one I will position over her, and then let's go to rectangle, and let's make this nice and big like this. Okay, and yeah, let's maybe keep it there. We can maybe make this even a tick bigger. Okay, I didn't show that last class, but let's do this for the backdrop. Shift A, let's add a spotlight. So that's a spotlight. So you see the cone, and this cone we will actually position onto the backdrop. So in case it goes into crazy directions again and you don't know where the object is, work with the object properties, so we reset the rotation and everything and the location, and then it's very easy to just find the object, line it up nicely, and then reposition it. Okay, so with a cone, you see we have no size actually for X and Y, but we have a size for the cone. Show cone, for example, there it shows you the area it illuminates, and there we can, for example, adjust the cone. And there's something called blend that defines basically from where the cone starts to the center how soft will the transition will be, and you will see what that will do when we actually do the rendering. I will set this to 1 for the moment. And then while, for example, looking through the camera, now I can maybe move this around and position it, so maybe, you see, we'll give her a nice halo. Okay, perfect. So let's go to the world setting and make sure we have use nodes. Maybe we can set this to white, and this we keep for 1 at the moment. And for white here, let's make sure this is all 0.8. Okay, good. So we're nearly done to start our renderings. So we basically now have everything ready. Some call it like a 3-key system. So you have our 3 lighting systems, 1, 2, 3. And as I mentioned, that's kind of like the amount of lights very often you only need. You need a nice key light that illuminates your scene. We need some fill lights from a side, maybe a fill light on the top. And if we have a backdrop, we can also illuminate the backdrop with it. And we also will have some sort of environment or environmental lighting. So the key now is to try to balance everything out so it just doesn't look like this. So here, for example, I will turn on the render engine and it's all totally overexposed. Okay, so I will actually, in this view here, go to this perspective view, and then I will switch to render. And the first thing is what we should do, maybe background lighting. Let's set this to 0 so you see our environment is dark. Then step by step now we can select the lights and, for example, turn them off. It's actually good practice before we do anything to try to see how actually the different lights really work. Okay, so maybe let's work with the top light. We turn on the value 1 or 10 or 50. You see step by step light is coming in. If we now take a look at the side and move, for example, this light around, and you see how actually the position of the light will influence our scene. Now the light is behind, so it illuminates more the backdrop. It's above, and here, for example, in front. But in front, in terms of the light goes down, but not directly shining onto it. But when I would rotate this one, you will see it gets a little bit more light directly sent directly on the face. Also interesting is, for example, the shape of the shadows. See, again, this is a very big area light, so the shadow is very soft. Let's make this a 3 centimeter by 2 centimeter. So it's a very small light. And you see actually now this works, or this looks more like a light source that does not have, for example, a diffuser in front. So it's very, very harsh, very sharp, and the shadows are strong. So you see the size of the light really impacts the harshness of the illumination and the softness of the shadow. Now this is 30 and 20. If we go 3 meters and 2 meters, you see the illumination also gets softer and then the shadows get softer. So this is a great, kind of like a great fill light. Okay, so let's route this one back. Let's go to there and let's maybe turn this one off. Okay. So let's work maybe with the right light. Number 1, there is just a little bit of lighting, 5, 10, 20, 50. You might ask, well, what are the correct values? And that's actually something you need to figure out, because the light can be really far away and be very strong and still not really illuminating your scene correctly. So the position of the light obviously is important, because the render engine tries to simulate reality by using kind of like a math code, how to render everything that's based on light physics. So with a distance, the light source, with a distance, the light loses its energy. So when I get this one very close, You see with 100 this is way too overexposed, and a little bit further away it then actually looks a lot better. So again, size of the light, the strength, and the distance to the object, that is what you have to put into balance. But obviously you don't want to have a major light 1 kilometer away being as bright as a supernova. Be smart about it. And again, for this, use actually photos you can find about how to design a studio in real life as a reference. Now I mentioned before we have something like key light and fill light. So this is, for example, our key light. It illuminates our object mainly from the left, and the right is kind of like in the shadow. It's not very good. So we can select the right light and give it a smaller value, so we only fill. So maybe 20, 30. What does this one have? This one has 100. Okay, maybe 50. Yeah, and there's, you know, this whole scene gets more light. I still see the shadows. I don't blow them out. This one, maybe I move it a tick further away. There. Okay. And if I take this one and maybe add some light there as well. There. And one easy way how I can see the different lights, how they work, is not by just selecting a light and then pressing H. Well, I mean that works, but now I have to Alt H, and then sometimes the software has to recreate the data for rendering. So what I would propose you is, at this point already, we start positioning the lights onto different layers. So my camera, and it's empty, I put onto maybe this layer, and then maybe my left light, next layer, my right light onto the following layer, this onto the next one, and this one maybe here. Perfect, because now I can actually simply turn on the different layers, and you see in this way trigger visibility. I don't have to undo anything, because if I hide an object, then I can press Alt H to unhide it, or it's based on how you want to work. You can also take a look at the outliner. So maybe you will have, in this case, your UI sliced up this way. So this is my area light. Okay, just hide it, and you can work around and see everything. Maybe the light on top I want to turn off, and then you can go back and show them. That's a different way you can do that. But sometimes I have different light rigs, so different light configurations, and then in that case I find it easier to just spread them out onto different backdrops, layers. Okay, so let's maybe see what can we do with our background. So this one, maybe 0.1, we can shoot in just a little bit of light. That brightens up everything just a notch. And then the rest we can turn on. Okay, and that's basically, as you can see, a little bit of how to design your studio backdrop 101. So these are the key elements. You have your background color information, or we load an HDRI into here, so in reflection something shows up. We have our left and right lights, which we can use then for key and fill. If we want, we can work with a top light. And all these lights don't necessarily, so this can also be a key light if I want that the majority of the light comes actually from the top. Then when we want to work with the backdrop, we can also add a light, for example, to, oops, that was the wrong slider. Can add light also into the backdrop. So for example, it shows up. So when we do a rendering, there we have this nice illumination. So the last thing to cover now is rendering size and sample settings, etc. And then how do we do the actual rendering? Because currently this is all just a preview. And you see this is kind of grainy. And if you take a look here, it says path tracing samples 32. So when we go to the camera and you go to dimensions, this one is important, output is important, film is important, so we can drag film up, and sampling is important, and output will be important. Now we can keep this one for later. Okay, let's start with dimensions. First here, with dimensions, we actually adjust the final proportion of our image. So let's say this should be 800 by 800 pixels. You see this is a square. Now X and Y, 400. Now you see now it's a band, 600. And the size of the camera will always be proportionally representing X and Y values. So it's not that inside the 3D view right now, these are 800 and 600 pixels. But when we later click on render, then actually it will create an image that will be 8 by 600 pixels. The percent scale below actually means now this is 800 by 600. If we go 50%, then obviously 400 by 300. I, for example, do a lot of furniture renderings for my work, so I have to make renderings which are very large so they can be printed. So I have values of 5,000 pixels, but I don't want to make renderings always that big, so very often then I just work with 1/10 of it or so, and then for final rendering I send it back to 100. Okay. Sampling. Now this is the one that's going to be interesting. So with sampling, we basically turn on or specify how often the software should clean up the image till, for example, it looks nice and smooth. So I have preview and render. Now render is for the final image. Preview, this is what we see here right now. If I set this to 2 and, for example, do a refresh, you see 2 steps, it basically stops. But if I set this, for example, to 2000, I can let it cook. And then at one point, I might see actually no grain anymore. And then that's the number, for example, I can use and enter into render. So it's rendering and rendering. So you can still see there's a little bit of grain and there's a little bit of grain. Well, you see it gets progressively cleaner already. And now we are like at 200. So I assume probably when I set this to 400 or so, I'm just guessing right now, I will get a value that's good. So again, these numbers are really based on the size of your not the size, the design of your scene, the object, the materials, the light sources. So I found this to be the best way to figure out what I have to enter for rendering. At one point, just do a preview, and then we can let it cook. And then when you have a good value visually, then we can enter it. So you see I was actually close with 400. We're at 300, so 400. Okay, good. Before we continue, I forgot to show something. Under dimensions, there's something called border. So you see when you turn border on, that's actually pretty nice. It actually renders only what's inside the camera. And let me select the camera and let's turn this one back, maybe to 70. Okay. So if I press Shift Z, you see the whole scene renders. And if I turn border on, then only what's inside the camera actually renders. And you see the numbers are much faster because instead of rendering this whole viewport, the software only has to render what's inside the camera. And with Shift B in the camera, we can even specify a particular area we only want to work on. And there you see how quick the numbers jump up. So I could, for example, zoom in, select one particular area, and then let it cook. And then see at one point, does it look good? No, 400, as I guessed. Or maybe let's preview there. We have shadow, and there's also a concave area. And yeah. So, and then once you're done, then we can turn border off or border on, but see, oh, it's always the same. So Shift B over the whole area, and then with border, basically you can then set the border rendering to the complete camera. So again, Shift B, that allows you to mark an area. If we now Shift B over the complete area, or complete camera, we basically say, well, no border. You see the border is gone. And then when we turn the border rendering on here, instead of using the smaller area, now it just clips it to the camera. Okay. So that was sampling and film. I would like to show you this. So transparent, when we turn this on, well, there's something we see. Well, we have a backdrop, so it blocks actually the backdrop. But if I move the backdrop to the side and I have this transparent, you see now this gray is actually the color from this very low background. But let's say I would like to use an HDRI image to illuminate my scene, but I don't want it to show up inside the rendering. Then I can simply select transparent. So wherever I have a transparent background, so there's no geometry like in the left side, then when we do the rendering, we can create an image. When we load it into Photoshop or Illustrator, the background is also transparent. Okay, good. Talking about how to save. Let's go to the next one, output. There are two things we have to set. First, the location, maybe the desktop, accept. So now I would render to user, my name, and then desktop. And then the format. Forget JPEG. JPEG has no ability to show a background being transparent, and it has artifacts. PNG, that's the format you want to use. And when you want to have a transparent background, you also need to have RGBA turned on. So A stands for alpha. So it saves actually the transparent background. Okay, I will make this to 20 so it renders quicker. Now we are ready to do a rendering. We either can click on render or go to render. And there's our image. Oh, that wasn't actually too slow. See, when I set this actually to 100, it takes a little bit longer to render. And then step by step, the software will create all the different tiles. And there, we're done. Okay, so this is actually now the final image. This is not just a preview. And to save it, we can go to, we are inside the UV image editor. We can go to image and then save as. Go to your desktop or wherever you want to save it, click save, and you're done. And that's kind of like the process, how then we can configure also all the settings we need for our first renderings, the dimensions, the sampling, maybe a transparent background, and the file format.